ethics. Ethics is the philosophical study of moral actions. It looks at what things are good and what things are bad. Ethics itself comes from the Greek word ethikos, meaning character, and it's all concerned with looking at morality. And morality comes from the Latin word moralis, which means basically looking at what's good and we're looking at what's bad. There are three types of ethics. Normative ethics just looks at what is good and what is bad, simple as. The second kind of ethics is descriptive ethics, and that looks at what different beliefs think is what's good and what is bad. So, for example, Christians might think some things are good, and Muslims might think different things are good. Finally, the third type of ethics is meta-ethics, and this looks at also what is good and what is bad, but it also looks at why do we call things good and why do we call things bad. Right, so there's generally two kinds of ethics. You've got absolutism, which holds the view that whatever is right and whatever is wrong. There's no grey areas, there's nothing in between. It's just whatever is right and what is wrong. It doesn't depend on the situation, it's just the way it's held. It's absolute. The other view is relativism, and that holds the view that, it could be right, but it could be wrong, and it kind of depends on certain circumstances. So some people would hold the view, abortion is wrong because it's killing. Abortion could be right because, it could withhold the mother's life, or something like that. In summary, absolutists think that moral truths are fixed for all the time. Moral actions will be right or wrong in themselves. They are intrinsic. It is irrespective of the circumstance, the culture, or opinion, or anything like that. These absolutists think that, something is right or wrong according to a moral rule within us, rather than whether acts concerned with ends or consequences. And the best example of an absolutist is probably Immanuel Kant, who we'll come on to into a minute. And finally, relativists think that moral truths, they can vary. They depend on the culture, the time, the place, the religion, all this sort of things. They are subjective, subject to all those things which I just mentioned. Normative ethics, which I explained earlier, can be split down into two types. You have teleological ethics and you have deontological. Wow, that's a bit of a hard word to say. Teleological. This is going to be really hard. Part 3. Normative ethics, which I explained earlier, can be split down into two types. You have teleological ethics and deontological ethics. Teleological ethics looks at the consequences or outcome of an action in order to determine its rightness or wrongness. We experience the word teleological in philosophy, and just to remind you, teleos is the Greek word for end, i.e. looking at the outcomes or end of an action to determine its goodness. The other type of ethics is deontological ethics, and this is the view that moral actions are intrinsically good or intrinsically wrong. It's irrespective of the circumstances, and moral judgment is contained within the act alone. Utilitarianism is a type of teleological ethics. It looks at the outcome of an action to determine its goodness, so it is called a consequentialist theory. The theory of utility, or utilitarianism, was first proposed by Jeremy Bentham. Bentham decided an action was good or bad according to how much happiness or pleasure it would bring to the greatest number of people. This type of argument is therefore quantitative, and it is a type of utilitarianism about pleasure and happiness, and it is called a hedonistic theory. Okay, so coming back to utilitarianism and the hedonistic theory, Jeremy Bentham said that pleasure was the highest good. Now, Greeks had already thought of this at the time. They said eudaimonia, which meant well-being. This is very similar to Jeremy Bentham's idea. So basically, Jeremy Bentham is saying pleasure is the highest good. And as he said, if we look at nature, there's my window there. There's nature, there are two things in it. There is pain and there is pleasure. Now what Jeremy Bentham is saying, something is morally right if it brings more pleasure than pain. On the flip side of that, if something brings more pain than pleasure, it is morally wrong. So therefore, he measures whether something is morally right and morally wrong using something called the hedonistic calculus. And there are 7 different points of the hedonistic calculus for working out whether something is good or bad. And I can't remember them, so I'm going to have to read them off the sheet. Number 1, the intensity of the pleasure. Number 2, the duration of the pleasure caused. Number 3, the certainty of the pleasure. Number 4, the remoteness of the pleasure. Number 5, the chance of a succession of pleasures. Number 6, the purity of the pleasure. And number 7, the extent of the pleasure, so how universal it is. So overall, Jeremy Bentham is saying that whether something is good and whether something is bad can be measured in a quantitative way. This is the final chapter for this programme, and this is chapter 6. Utilitarianism can be divided into 4 types. I know there's so many branches, it's like, what's that TV program called? Who Do You Think You Are? It's ridiculous. Number 1, act utilitarianism. This is like the general utilitarianism as a whole. It just decides what is the best outcome for the majority of people. The second type of utilitarianism is strong rule utilitarianism, and that says that it has to be proved to the majority that this is the best outcome and it should always be applied. But the most important thing is it has to be approved. Weak rule utilitarianism, which is the third type, is that moral rules should be applied, just generally, unless the interests of the majority say it's not worth doing so. And the fourth type of utilitarianism is preference utilitarianism, and this was proposed by Peter Singer, and he says that desires and preferences should be taken into account when deciding the best outcome for the majority. Good night.